Alrighty. So welcome. I want to say I'm looking forward to this panel. I want to thank Craig and the whole Climate Action Reserve team for having us, and this should be very interesting. When I first thought about what I was going to open my remarks with, I was thinking about all kinds of very technical and regulatory and market functions, and then a headline came across my email that said the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs are going to offset their flights, their GHG emissions from the flights in a sustainability effort. And I thought, well, that's something you don't see every day. Where hockey, I can talk about hockey on a panel like this, and I was talking to another entity about that, and they brought up the issue of refrigerants, and so it was an area that I didn't even think about. They're talking about their GHG from flights, but you think about refrigerants and the systems needed anyway, that's my opening thought. I'm going to give the bios here in a second, but offsets have been rather secure in the system for a while, but recently there's been some news been made, and I think we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the regulatory aspects, we're going to talk about some of the market aspects, we're going to talk about some of the protocols and what CAR is doing. So let me introduce you to my panelists. Let's see. Sorry, I had it right here. Oh, here we go. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is John Costantino, and I used to be a regulator, and now I help folks that need to comply and find opportunity and mitigate risk in all these programs. On the end is Jason Gray. He's Chief of Climate Change Program Evaluation Branch. He oversees and implements the Cap and Trade program, so he's an important guy. He previously was the Market Monitoring Section Manager, and prior to that, a staff attorney at CARB. His duties include implementing and supervising the whole program. Jason manages and represents the board and the governor's climate and forest task force. And before entering the legal profession, he worked in environmental education, biodiversity, conservation, sustainable development, worked with the Peace Corps and the World Wildlife Federation in the Central African country of Gabon. Did I say that right? And he wrote a book, Glimpses Through the Forest, Memories of Gabon. So I encourage you to check that one out. And then next to me is Chelsea Bryant, who joined Climco in 2017, where she's now the Vice President and leader of policy and advisory team. She's a chartered financial analyst and has more than 10 years experience in commodities markets, investing and trading, is an expert in hedge fund strategy, policy, advocacy, regulatory impact, and carbon pricing trends. And prior to Climco, she managed the environmental commodity portfolio for a large regulated entity and traded contracted millions of GHG tons. And Max, I won't try and butcher his last name. He's with the Climate Action Reserve, has been here a decade. He works in the renewable and utility areas as director, and he leads policy team in all non-forestry technical work and protocol development. And so we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He holds a master's in environmental science and management from UC Santa Barbara. And so we're gonna have opening statements. Each panelist has a sort of subject area that they're gonna talk about. We're gonna go Chelsea, Max, Jason in that order, and then after that we'll have a moderated discussion based on some of the relevant things that were in the news and what the next 12 months look like, and then after that we're gonna open it up to questions from the audience and let you guys participate. So with that, Chelsea.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. So with a show of hands, how many of you flew to NACW? Okay, I want you to keep those hands up, keep them up. How many of you flew for over 2 hours? Over 4 hours? Over 6 hours? Over 8 hours? Oh, we got some stragglers here, okay. So I think that this story will probably resonate for some of my fellow travel companions. I am from Calgary, Alberta, so up north and a little bit to the east. And I had to travel last week from Calgary to Pennsylvania. And so there's no direct route from Calgary. We always have to get routed through Chicago. So while I was about to embark on my flight, I got a lovely notification that there was going to be snow in Chicago. Ha ha ha, I'm from Canada. This does not scare me. So I headed off to Chicago, where, at no surprise, I'm sure, my flight was canceled. And so I was stuck in a snowstorm in April in Chicago in the airport for about 12 hours. At which point I embarked on my next leg of the journey with the sweet smell of agitation in the air. I sat down in my seat, let a breath of relief out of my lungs, and thought, okay, I'm almost there. At which point, the pilot got onto the phone and said, airline passengers, I'm sure you're well aware that we are flying into a tornado. No, I was not aware. I would not get onto an airline craft if I knew I was flying into a tornado. But no worries. We have a tornado warning slightly before we're going to land, and then another tornado warning slightly after we're going to land. So we're just going to go right in between those and get our aircraft safely into Pennsylvania. So all I could imagine in my head was these two tornadoes coalescing into a single massive storm as we were trying to land, and thinking this was my last moments. Hashtag climate change is real. So I'm sure that that message resonates with a lot of the people in the crowd today. And so what does that mean when we think of the current state of play with offsets and the future of the offset market in California? And one of the things that I always want to focus on and do focus on is that what we need to enact in terms of change is aggregate global emission reductions. And in absence of incentivizing private capital to invest in these emission reductions, we're simply not going to get there in terms of hitting the aggressive targets that we need to hit in order to mitigate climate change. So I'm incredibly proud to work for Climeco. Climeco started 10 years ago as a project developer for emission reduction projects, offsets specifically. And over the last decade has mitigated more than 16 million tons of GHG emissions and driven tens of millions of dollars of private capital into these markets. That's exceptionally exciting, and we're seeing the expansion of that initiative into RNG and into other types of projects. So both in the compliance sphere, where we do things like ODS destruction, as well as ag methane projects within California's cap and trade program, but also very largely in the voluntary markets. So really seeing organizations willing to invest private capital, our organization willing to invest private capital into voluntary emission abatement. So it's really important for us to look at both the compliance offset market, but also we're seeing private capital driven into voluntary markets by organizations that have significant sustainability targets that they want to achieve. Our organization, just as a practical reality of being such a substantive investor in emission reduction projects, naturally had to become a market expert, because I'm sure you can imagine if we created environmental commodities and had no idea how to sell them, we would not be here to talk to you today. So we do work across a variety of environmental commodities globally and help commercially optimize the transactions both within our organization and for our customers. I personally lead our policy and advisory team that focuses on advocacy efforts for our customers in understanding how to shape the regulations that they need to be compliant with, and then also to participate in driving environmental stewardship and emission abatement within the industrial sector. I'm always incredibly impressed with North American organizations who really are taking a leadership role in adopting innovative technology to drive down emissions. And so it's something that's near and dear to my heart to ensure that we protect our organizations and industries in North America against global competitiveness issues and carbon leakage. Because again, I want to reflect on the fact that it's aggregate global emission reductions that are so incredibly important. And in absence of having strong regulatory leadership and other ancillary services around these markets to help provide the protocols and systems that are needed to actually create these environmental commodities, we simply couldn't see private capital driven into these markets. So I think the viewpoint on the panel that I'm going to bring today is as not only a project developer, but also private capital and how we see these flow into the markets and drive these emission abatements, and also an industry perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Max, you want to tell us what's going on in sort of the world that you live?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thank you to my other panelists and to all of you in the audience here. As one of the hosts of this conference, I really appreciate that you're all here. It makes a big difference because it's really boring if nobody shows up. So Climate Action Reserve, as an offset project registry, we are developing the protocols and participating in the compliance and the voluntary markets. And it's interesting coming to this event year after year and seeing the way the conversation has changed. This is my 11th NACW. In the early years, we had maybe 10 or 12 projects in our registry, and the conversations were still about measuring footprints and, will anybody buy these credits and can we do this? And then we've seen such a shift over time to now we're talking in very mature terms about the market, and there's not dramatic changes in terms of how the compliance offsets are working and how the voluntary offsets are working. People understand it now, and we can focus on expanding it. And so I think it's an exciting time. In terms of the compliance market, we're interested to see over the next 5-10 years as the cap starts to come down, is that going to really start to put more pressure on the need for offsets? Are we going to start to see prices coming up? Is that going to start to expand the number of projects that are viable? We're really interested to see if new protocols are adopted. We've got some good ideas. We think grassland and nitrogen management would make excellent compliance offset protocols. So we're watching intently, as everybody else. The DEBS issue is an interesting wrinkle. I don't know that it changes too much for the way that the registries are going to operate. I think that's mostly going to be the projects dealing directly with the regulator, but it'll change probably the projects that are coming through and that we'll be processing. But then on the voluntary side, I feel like we're also seeing more activity and we're seeing more interest. I think the pool of people who are potentially looking at offsets is getting bigger. We're seeing more carbon neutrality interest from sectors like universities and cities, more effort to standardize those types of things. And once you've got a standard for something like city carbon neutrality that explains, yes, you can use offsets, and here's how you can use offsets, it becomes an easier and more comfortable for the cities to do. So I think we're going to see new voluntary buyers. But we're also seeing more interest in kind of innovative approaches, not just going out and buying offsets, but maybe finding projects that they want to partner with, or insetting, looking within their own sphere of influence, and really trying to tell a story through the offset projects. So as a registry, we try to support that as much as we can, help people understand the protocols, help them understand the projects, but also get them to help us understand where the protocols need to go and be responsive. We continue to update protocols. We adopted Landfill 5.0 yesterday, so that protocol's had a long road since 2007, and we think that the new version is going to really help give more opportunities to some of the projects that are already in the system, and I'll provide a new pathway to extended crediting periods, but also perhaps provide some interesting pathways for new projects to make it in. And then also minor updates, again, back to being responsive to the market. We're updating the grassland protocol. We just released a new nitric acid production protocol, and we're updating the nitrogen management protocol. Minor updates, but to try and directly respond to project developers and verifiers and the feedback that we're getting. The other focus for us in terms of offsets would be our neighbors to the north and south. We're seeing a lot of excitement in Mexico. The Mexico Forest Protocol, which has been around for several years now. We've now got 6 projects in the system. 3 of them have gone through verification. We're having a lot of success with our staff going down and doing trainings, helping train the local community into supporting the projects, creating jobs in the community to support those projects. We're exploring an expansion of our Mexico ODS protocol. We're very excited about that. And then also working in Canada. Canada's obviously had some ups and downs. And, heartbreak for us too. We were developing the Ontario protocols until the Ford administration came in and said to stop. But there was so much interest from the stakeholders in that. We've been able to continue work at least on the avoided grassland conversion with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. And so we're really excited that that's going to be our first voluntary protocol in Canada that we can actually issue CRTs for Canadian projects. And I hope it's just the tip of the iceberg, especially since we started working on more than a dozen protocols. So we've got a lot of half-finished files. And the other thing about the Canadian grassland, the protocol's not even done. We're hoping to have it later this year, but there's already interest from a corporate buyer in funding pilot projects to actually road test it. And we've certainly learned over the last 4 or 5 years that pilot projects make a big difference to protocol success in the long term. Getting projects on the ground during protocol development and working through the kinks and sort of learning as we go.
Great. Thank you. Jason, I think we're all curious to hear what you have to say about sort of the regulatory state as it sits. I mean, you just went through, you, all of us together went through a rulemaking last year, and it just kicked in in fact, I asked a question the other day. I said, how many people know how long Debs has been a part of the actual rulemaking? And of course, it was a lawyer that said 3 weeks. And so let us know what's going on and what you see ahead of you.
Great, no thanks, and thanks to follow both of you, and excited to be here at NACW again. And I was debating with Max whether we just talk about ties, and he said, well, I was on a panel and we talked about socks, so he has some pretty cool Mario Brothers socks on right now. I digress. Yeah, I'll talk about some of the updates we've had in the regulatory framework in the last year, more recent ones in terms of the new rulemaking. I did want to start with just stressing the importance, as you guys, all three of you have mentioned, in terms of this space. The purpose of offsets, at least in the regulatory program, which I think is very similar in other areas, is how do you address these emissions that aren't otherwise being addressed? How do you incentivize technology, incentivize action that's not otherwise occurring? And that's the whole point. So it continues to be an incredibly important part of our program of working in sectors that aren't directly regulated to find ways to address those emissions, to find ways that do that in beneficial ways to the overall market, also beneficial ways to all the co-benefits that come from offsets. So I just wanted to stress the importance we continue to see on the offsets program and the component of that in our carbon market. Still the limited amount, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Just for a sense of scale, it's nowhere near what needs to happen, but we've issued 152 million credits for reductions for projects and actions that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. These all represent real, additional, permanent, verifiable, enforceable actions and reductions, and just as the voluntary market is looking at. And I think that's, it's a great start. Clearly more needs to happen, as the IPCC mentions in their recent report, on all different sectors. But this is one important financing tool that is robust, that's actually representing real action. We've issued credits and projects in 35 states, which is, I think, quite an incredible, and I know there's a lot more in voluntary spaces, but that's quite an incredible climate diplomacy effort. Not all of these states have robust climate programs, but this is an area where we're able to actually engage with a lot of different people in a lot of different states on carbon mitigation. And it's getting to be on the compliance side as well as the voluntary side, quite a bit of value, which is one of the co-benefits for the folks that are doing these projects. Roughly, conservative estimate after subtracting out our buffer pool for forestry, it's about $1.5 billion in value for that action. For action, again, that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. So let me jump into the actual question, thanks John, on what are the recent regulatory changes. So we just completed about an 18-month public process, a robust process, as those of you involved in it know, a legal process of public stakeholder engagement, of comment periods, and conformance to new legislative requirements. That regulation went through 18 months of this process. Our board voted and adopted the changes in December, and they just went into effect April 1st. Some of these lower the usage of offsets. The legislation approved the program, approved that part of the program with a lower offset usage limit in the post-2020 portion of the program, so that hopefully is not a surprise to folks. But for emissions from 2021 to 2025, it cuts the current usage limit in half, so that'll go to 4%, and then it increases by legislation that limit up to 6% from 2026 to 2030. So the recent regulatory amendments have put that into regulation, specified the process and those numbers in regulation pursuant to the legislature. That doesn't kick in until 2021, but there is a provision related to that that would require of that limit, no more than half of the limit can come from projects that don't provide direct environmental benefits in the state, or DEBs for short. So we are developing the process for what would need to be assessed for providing DEBs. For those who are steeped in our rulemaking efforts, we have staff reports that talk through what types of information we'd be looking for in terms of showing scientific evidence that there's a direct environmental benefit in the state, and a process by which projects that aren't located in California, how they would apply. So I'd anticipate we'll have some public guidance and some process to help folks kind of submit information to us if they want their project to qualify for that provision. I know there's a lot of questions on that, so stay tuned. We will have some process to kind of help walk people through that. Additional upcoming work, the Compliance Offset Protocol Task Force, also required by legislation. I'm getting questions probably on a twice-a-day basis on this one. So AB 398, this new legislation requires us to have a task force in place to provide advice to my board on what types of new project types or protocols that could provide direct environmental benefits in state should we be looking at, would they recommend we look at. On this one, I think folks should anticipate a solicitation process, a public solicitation process, where you'd apply to be and describe why you meet one of the statutory criteria to be on this task force, and then we'll take that through the public process of our board. Since that will be a statutorily mandated and board-created body, it will be subject to public meeting laws, so I anticipate we'll have some information about how that'll play out. Let's see. For future changes, I'm not going to tell you any new protocol types or things that we're looking at. We don't do that in this type of setting, but I can say we have mentioned publicly different areas of our regulation we'd like to assess whether there's amendments to be made, including outside of the offset space. For all of those, for any of our regulatory processes, we would announce this through a public listserv, invite folks to whether it be public workshops or public hearings, and we'll make sure that that's available to everybody. I don't have a timing today to share, but I think we're working through a process for how do we align a lot of the different things that our agency is working on and making sure that that's really transparent and public. So stay tuned for listservs. I think that's the best I can do in there for now. All right, I wanted to shift really briefly to something on the forest protocol. And I think this is also kind of the current development phase. There's been some rumbling and some media articles about leakage rates in the forest protocol of late, and I just wanted to briefly touch on that. First of all, our protocol, just like in the initial phases in the voluntary market, they go through these robust public processes where the best available information at the time is assessed, and that's what's used to adopt the protocols. We've updated our forest protocol several times based on the same process, based on an assessment of that same type of best available information. We have over 100 forest projects, compliance projects in 21 states. From these projects, we have 7 tribes throughout the United States participating. 2 Alaska Native corporations are participating. And these projects, the tribal projects and the non-tribal projects, are really resulting in a lot of co-benefits from habitat protection, biodiversity, watershed, a lot of different co-benefits of this type of offset space. And these are all done through our protocol process based on action and work and results that otherwise would not have occurred. A recent news outlet published a policy brief that seeks to question some of the leakage assessments that are in the protocol. And again, we are always open to looking at the best available information. But I wanted to address this directly today because I've been hearing from a lot of people about this specific policy brief and some of the media that's come up around it. I think the first thing I'll say is the arguments in the policy brief are really the same arguments that were presented in litigation several years ago about additionality. So the process for how we design the protocol, how we assess that statutory requirement, and went through the California Supreme Court in terms of how the process that ARB used to approve those protocols. The assessment in the policy brief is really, I think it's showing a continual misunderstanding of how the protocol works. In the protocol, we acknowledge, I think everyone acknowledges that leakage is a complicated thing to assess. Our protocol, based on these years of development, both in the voluntary space and in the compliance market, assesses two different types of leakage. This is getting a little technical, but activity shifting leakage, which relates to mill deliveries of timber, and market shifting leakage, which relates to movement of wood products. So our protocol is doing the best, using the best available information to assess these two different types of leakage. The policy brief really uses two studies that were quite unrelated to our protocol, focused that were conducted for a different purpose, make some assumptions, not using the leakage assessments that are in our protocol, actually misunderstanding how we set baselines and how leakage is assessed, and develops a view that's just really not comparable. It's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. So I don't know how much more to say on it than that it continues to really not understand how the protocol works. And I really hate to harp on this here, but I guess that's part of my job. So we're always happy to walk people through how the protocol works. I think there's a lot of other folks in the room that are happy to walk people through how projects are implemented and how that the action and the credits are based on that action. It's not people getting credits for nothing. It couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, folks in the room can attest how hard it is to go through the protocol process. We'll make sure that we continue to get the correct information out, that we continue to learn. So as there's new information, we'll take that into account. And again, we'll do that through our public process, where everyone is invited. It's very transparent. We want to assess the best information available. And that's really the mechanism, the best mechanism, the legal mechanism we have to use, but also I think the best mechanism for assessing any changes to future versions of the protocol. So thanks.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate that sort of detailed, technical, and sort of timely response. This policy paper you mentioned just came out and it's been making the rounds, and here at the conference there's been a lot of questions about it. So that's probably my first question. I'll sort of throw it out and maybe everybody could weigh in a little bit. That through AB 398, which extended the cap and trade program, offsets became statutorily a thing, right? Before they were part of the program, but not part of statute, and now they're part of statute, so they're more permanent than they were. So knowing that, but knowing they're still under a tax, do you feel there's any risk, or what is the biggest risk to successful offset development from a market perspective, or a timing, or what is if you're an offset persons, what are you worried about these days?
Well, I'm going to reference my country, Canada, where I come from. So just as a quick anecdotal story, some of you may or may not know that Alberta was actually the first carbon market in North America. So they developed a early carbon market, which launched in 2007, and they actually had a 100% usage limit for offsets. And so that continued in effect all the way until 2018. And so we had a robust system that drove a lot of private capital into the system, had a very robust market as a result of that, even though it's much, much smaller in terms of magnitude and scale than California, obviously. Just simply because you had such a substantive use limit, you saw a lot of market interest, market participation, and a lot of private capital go into that market. We had a 44-year dynasty of a PC government in the province of Alberta, which changed 4 years ago, and we saw a massive flip in terms of the government leadership there. So with that change, it came very, very, very substantive stroke of pen risk because the regulation changed. Now we're going on about a week and a bit ago that we again elected a more right-leaning government in Alberta. And again, as you can imagine, they completely decided to eradicate the current program in place and instead replace it with another system. You have an overlay of the fact that the federal government in Canada is actually quite active in this discussion, and so they of course have their own system, and then we'll have an argument about equivalency and whether Alberta's meeting that. So in all of this, and the reason why I bring this up, is that regulatory stroke of pen risk is the single most important aspect when you look at investing into offset market and having a robust offset market. If you have regulatory stroke of pen risk, then people that invest millions of dollars in early action, do other things, suddenly are the first ones to get aggressively burned. And once burned, twice shy, there's no real interest in doing that again. So we've seen this really substantively in Canada simply as a result of the fact that we could have $650 million worth of compliance instruments wiped out like that if the federal government decides to react in a certain way. So there's some real problematic aspects to those things. So to your question, whether that gives more confidence into the offset market, although I would suggest that it would, there's always the concern about what stroke of pen risk could look like, what the next regulatory changes could look like, and then what are the implications to the market participants who've invested substantive resources and assets into these projects, because again, private capital is very concerned when you have these real significant stroke of pen risks that lead to the eradication of the underlying environmental attributes or their associated value.
You know, actually on that note, I feel like there's also been some, I guess, positive developments in terms of stroke of pen risk. You know, I think the last panel that was up here, JP was talking about 3 years ago, he was delivering the message that this could all fall apart right now, and then now with AB 398 and a supermajority, we've got a bit more certainty there at the programmatic level. But at the project level, there's been something sort of like stroke of pen risk, I guess, in the early stages of the compliance program where the ARB staff are having to interpret the protocols and interpret the program and figure it out, and sometimes things would change in a way that project developers weren't understanding or expecting. But I feel like the program's been operating now for enough years that we're starting to see with regulatory changes it's going the other direction a little bit. In some cases, the regulation's starting to adapt to problems that project developers were having, such as treatment of regulatory compliance and timing of the regulatory compliance periods there. Those kinds of things are actually starting to have a positive effect on project development, which I think is great. One other sort of minor thing, it's not necessarily a negative for project development, but in terms of offset supply, the LCFS is starting to eat a little bit into the livestock project supply. And so we're starting to see this interesting interaction with the different components of the California strategies. All good, great for the market and great for the state, but it's an interesting interaction.
Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk that most concerns me is if these programs aren't working. And I think we've seen in California that we hit our 2020 target early. We're getting the additional reductions through the offset program. So making sure that we're trying to hit every single piece that needs to be hit. That's the risk. I think the statutory changes provide some additional certainty. I think for just on the cap and trade, just on the offset component of the cap and trade program, we've learned a lot from experience. The scrutiny is still there. Making sure that we get the correct information out and make sure things are understandable, because it is a complicated program. I think that's on us to make sure that information risk is minimized, so folks actually understand the protocols, so folks actually understand the actions that are being taken. And I think that's something on anybody in this space. We're all working on our different aspects of making sure that's there, but the risk of not addressing emissions is the big risk here.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and then I promise I'll ask a Deb's question. So there was recently the first exchange-traded futures contract for offsets. We don't necessarily need to get into who or
Climco.
or how much or what, but what does that mean? What does that mean for the market to have that vehicle start to show up?
So I think it's really interesting because as you have a standardized form of contract, obviously it's all dependent on the liquidity of the associated product. So if you have an exchange-traded product that exists, but there's no liquidity associated with that product, then obviously that's not going to have much of a difference in terms of how the overall market functions. But to the extent that you can create a product that can drive liquidity, and we obviously saw this contract already trade, it does change the way the market functions because it's a much more streamlined transaction than you would otherwise see. So I come from a substantive background of bilateral negotiations and bilateral contracting that is over the counter for environmental commodities. And that's simply because I wasn't an on-screen trader in my past life, nor am I at Climco. I dealt with all of the commodities that traded through bilateral negotiations with the counterparty over the counter. And I can say that the one thing that you will see with these contracts is that there's no consistent form of agreement across the entire thing. So you have all of these different versions of contracts trading similar or the exact same commodities, and the associated terms of those contracts will actually have significant implications on the overall value of the commodity, as well as any contingent liability that may be taken on by the counterparties associated with that commodity. So it has been, I think, very challenging historically to take a commodity that isn't homogenized and transact it on screen, simply because of all these nuances that factor into how people want to contract for that commodity. When you have that type of contracting mechanism, it does lead to interesting implications in the market. You can see arbitrage, all these other things, because you have a level of opacity that you wouldn't normally see if you had an exchange-traded commodity. So I do think it's interesting as we start to see this evolve. I am very curious to see the liquidity of this specific product, but it is very exciting to see the commodity like this trade on an exchange, because you will not only have a much quicker transaction, it will be very clean in terms of how you're transacting, and it's very specific about the associated terms, conditions, and liabilities associated with that commodity.
You know, I don't have much to say in terms of the trading side of it, but when Derek from Climeco was talking about this in our workshop yesterday, he hit on an aspect of this that hadn't occurred to me, which I thought was very interesting. Providing a new mechanism for handling invalidation risk. And we've got 8 years of risk, for example, when you issue the credits. And we always think about it as 8 years of risk or 3 years of risk or 0 years of risk. But Derek was describing, no, that risk drops by a day every day, right? So you've got sometimes 7 years of risk or 6. And that's actually quite complicated thing for somebody to manage as a buyer and as a seller and figuring out the value. And so you guys as project developers being able to post it as a 0 in the future when it hits that allows sort of everybody to manage that risk in an interesting way that I thought seemed like it could be really helpful.
Yeah, not to repeat, I think it's just really exciting to see the level of certainty and confidence in the market to have that type of contract available. So I'm also very interested and excited to see how that develops and whether we see different terms develop in the future, but I think it's exciting.
Great, thank you. So let's switch back to DEBs a little bit. I know there's still a lot to be determined, but in general, this idea of DEBs has already carried forward outside of the jurisdiction that it started in, right? It's in Oregon, and others are thinking about this in a similar way. So I guess I'll go with I have a couple questions here, but I'll go with this question. What are the broader implications of DEBs, right? There's development, there's financing, there's how you're going to handle on a regulatory aspect. So I'll just ask the broader. Anybody can weigh in. We don't have to go in order. DEBs in general, good, bad, ugly. Who wants to?
Do you want to take this first?
Okay. Thanks. I mean, it's what the legislation required. So that's what our regulatory amendments are enacting. I think the requirements are that there's a benefit beyond the greenhouse gases that are credited. And the legislation described that or defined that in terms of watershed benefits and air pollution benefits. Our assessment in the rulemaking was that the projects located in state, given all the conservative estimates within those protocols and all the co-benefits of those are directly providing those benefits in state that are beyond the GHGs that are credited. And the process, which we are still kind of defining how that'll be assessed, but what types of information will be assessed, we've said looking at scientific information of where the project's located, is that providing a water or air pollution benefit. So, I mean, I don't want to answer the question on the Clint Eastwood reference there, but I think in terms of what the legislation requires, we've built that in the regulation. In terms of how folks manage that risk, I'm interested to hear what Chelsea and Max talk about.
I don't know if it's fundamentally good or bad. I think it's unnecessary, but it's in legislation. So it's here. I think one thing, if we do start to see more jurisdictions launching cap and trade programs, even if they're incorporating this language, it sort of dilutes the impact a little bit because it's expanding the geography for those projects to participate in the program. So in that sense, if we're going to have it in one place, then it doesn't necessarily hurt if we've got it in more places, I suppose.
So I'm going to preface my response to this by saying that the reasoning that the DEBS provisions made it into the legislation are real, and there's absolutely, very, very clear concerns about air quality and water quality that need to be addressed, and I would never want to undermine or invalidate those concerns because they're significant. That being said, I always have a personal concern about if we're looking at the broader context of climate change and aggregate global emission reductions. When you start to see a bifurcation of market pricing for emission reductions that from a climate change basis, a ton of CO2e is a ton of CO2e, then we're actually having a less efficient way of actually mitigating the same volume of emissions. So when you have a situation like you mentioned earlier about we're seeing LCFS credits take volume away from the offset market, well, obviously, any type of market that exists is going to commercially optimize. So if a project has the opportunity to create a better capital return from selling LCFS credits than from selling offsets, then they're going to optimize, and that makes sense, and that's how private capital works, and that's how private capital should function. That being said, if you're talking about the exact same ton of CO2e reduction, now you're just paying a higher price for the exact same ton of CO2e reduction. So fundamentally speaking, when you start to have all these bifurcation of products that have overlapping considerations, then you have a concern of actually having a higher price for the exact same reductions. And I'll take that a little bit of a step further. When you're looking at domestic industry and global competitiveness issues, we don't at this point in time have a global price on carbon. And so to the extent that we see costs get to such a level that it starts to undermine the global competitiveness of emissions-intensive trade-exposed industry, what that simply means is the domestic production will shut down, local jobs will be lost, the local economy will be hurt, and that production demand does not go away globally. So it simply gets filled in other areas that don't have carbon pricing, that may not have the same focus on environmental stewardship that we do here. And for that, that's not a win for me because that's not going to reduce aggregate global emissions. So maybe a slightly different perspective, but something that I think is important because we do want to have the lowest cost of abatement for those exact same tons of CO2e.
Great. I'm just going to ask the audience, are there questions you guys have? If so, we can let you guys. So we do have a couple of questions. I don't know if is there a microphone? I'm not sure. We didn't actually figure that one out in advance.
I think he's got a hand on you.
Say what? So Nico, you want to ask a question, and then we can do a couple audience questions. So let me ask this question while we're getting that figured out. This was sent to me, someone who knew I was going to be here. Do you think the forest carbon offset protocol could be tweaked to create a new source of finance at scale for action to reduce wildfire risk in California and protect air quality and public health? So I guess the question is, can the protocol create a wildfire finance mechanism? I guess is one way to say that.
So in a sense, the existing protocol does that because if the forest owner takes actions to reduce their wildfire risk, they will get a lower risk rating. They'll put less into the buffer pool and keep more credits in their pocket. So it's a little different than just a wildfire project, but there is a built-in incentive within the forest protocol to do the best you can to reduce your wildfire risk. I don't know if that's good.
Nico, do you have a mic yet? Or do you just want to, there we go.
Hi, Nico Van Alstyne, Shepard Mullen. This is a question really for you, Jason, and I'll apologize in advance, but you take the stage, you're going to get this question every time. As been the discussion to now has noted, the two chief barriers, or not barriers, but drags on the liquidity of the offsets market are, on the one hand, invalidation risk with the buyer liability provisions and the DEBS provisions. The DEBS provisions, of course, as noted, are in law. There's nothing that ARB can do about those. I'm hopeful that at one point a court might address the issue. We'll see. But the invalidation risk and how ARB manages it, that is entirely within the regulation. And I just want to note that Ontario's program, which the governor certified as equally as stringent as California in order to link, did not have a buyer liability provision. They addressed the problem of invalidation risk through an insurance pool and seller liability. So I think it's time for ARB to consider, again, as it has periodically over the years, reconsider its provision of buyer liability in the regulation. And I would like to know, will you guys be doing that?
I'm going to punt and talk about my socks. Here you go. So, I can't really opine on potential changes we might make. What I will say is, if folks have suggestions they'd like us to consider, please send them. I mean, we consider every piece of information we get. We consider different suggestions. So if you've got thoughts of how that could be looked at, where we can continue to ensure the atmospheric integrity of the program, which is our fundamental reason for that risk assessment, send us your proposals. I think we've seen them in the past. Happy to look at them continuously, but yeah. Thank you. I do have nice socks. I'm just kidding.
Is there another question in the audience? Can't. Yeah, back in the back.
Well, hi there. I guess this is a question for Jason too. We have two compliance forest projects, and we're going to be starting another one. And I was just wondering when the draft protocols are going to come out for the 2020 forest, past 2020 forest protocols, and if there's going to be more. I've heard there's going to be higher leakage, and if common practice is going to be adjusted with all the wildfires, if that's going to go down. I just was wondering if you can give me any feel where you're at with the new protocols for forests coming up. So.
Sure, and I think I'll repeat what I said earlier. Just we don't have a timing for when potential changes could come in. I mean, I think we want to assess the best information available on. We've heard from lots of folks in this room and elsewhere about other changes they'd like to see and different things we have. So I don't have a timing for when any changes would occur. But I think the point you make in terms of wildfire risk and things, we want to make sure we're looking at the best information available when we do make updates.
Anybody else? Up here?
And I guess the question's for the entire panel. In California, you're having the trend of, again, not only the finance systems being set up to encourage offsets, but also the education and technical expertise. And I'd heard Indigenous peoples mentioned earlier. So what way is California lending that trend across the world and the globe, not only the regulatory and compliance side of things, but the economic development of improving communities, including landowners, Indigenous peoples, as well as the regulation and the regulatory authorities?
Jesse, do you want to say anything about sort of to answer that in a way that relates to the international efforts that are?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just briefly say that, I've always been impressed with California's environmental leadership. So, if it's always a bit of a chicken or the egg, right? So there's the conversation about global competitiveness. And so if you don't have a global price on carbon, then how do you address global competitiveness? But then you could have no carbon pricing, and then everyone would be equally competitive in that context. And so you really need to have environmental leadership to drive change globally. We can't all just sit back and wait for something to happen, because it'll never happen. And so I've always been incredibly impressed by California, because they've developed such a wide suite of complementary policies to drive towards their emission reduction targets, while also creating conversations, memorandums of understanding, and helping to inform with their environmental leadership by preemptively setting up these markets how other countries can do this. linkages, fungibility of instruments, conversations about how you could operationalize Article 6. So you're really talking very, very, very high level at an international level, how we can have, internationally traded mitigation outcomes. So really, without having jurisdictions like California who are demonstrating this type of environmental leadership, you would not have private investment to the same extent driving into these emission reduction projects. So there would be no mechanism to monetize the emission reduction. So how can you do that? How can you invest? But also, you are now having them really set the blueprint and show other jurisdictions how you can design programs effectively, what works, what doesn't work, and then they can too adopt similar regulations and programs. So I mean, a perfect example of this is Canada. Unfortunately, we obviously saw the implosion of the Ontario cap and trade program, but really the prior government had a very strong commitment and relationship with the California government in developing their program to meet the same levels of stringencies and requirements as California. Quebec also took the same position, and so that's continued to be a linked market. California's leadership is driving that conversation, and it's actually helping to demonstrate a blueprint for how other jurisdictions can adopt programs that functionally work and drive emission reductions. So.
Yeah, and I'd say on engaging local communities, we've been most active around our Mexico Forest Protocol and had a lot of success there. But we've also been, I think, having some interesting experiences around our grasslands protocol and engaging with land trusts, and especially some of the smaller land trusts. We had our grassland pilot projects with a small land trust in Colorado that has now sort of gotten the carbon bug, and the woman that runs that land trust is going around and starting to work with other land trusts, and she's talking about, can I help train other land trusts, and can I work with others? And there's great benefits that come along with that. When you conserve the grasslands, then you start protecting the other ecosystem services that they provide, and also because of the protocol requirements, you're encouraging responsible grazing at the same time, because if you are overgrazing, you're going to have a problem with your project. So starting to see some effects there. We haven't had any tribal grassland projects yet, but we've been exploring what it would take to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I think great responses, and I really appreciate your response, Chelsea, in terms of the need and then the explanation of how they fit together of complementary policies. And I think that really goes again to what the IPCC says, is we got to do all of this. I think we've been fortunate in having governors and governments that are very interested in showing where things are working and working with others to see if that works in other jurisdictions. So the MOUs and that engagement has been not only fun to work on, but incredibly important. I think in terms of working with communities, and in particular with tribal and Indigenous governments, we have an interesting story here, and I think this is again to leadership, and this really goes to tribal leadership within California. So several tribes in California and also throughout the states, but in particular Yurok in California, really pushed us and said, we need to have a space within your program to benefit, because we have action we can do. We're already critical actors in terms of environmental and climate leadership, and I think we had a discussion to make sure that could happen. That engagement, either with other governments, tribal governments, communities, I think that approach to doing it in respectful ways, in transparent ways, has resulted in kind of a model that if other folks want to see how a state government engages with national governments or with sovereign nations, I think that's provided space for that discussion and also for those types of training opportunities. I can say that one of my most fun things to work on in terms of the offset piece of our cap and trade program is engaging with folks that are doing carbon projects for very specific purposes. And I think tribal projects are one of the best examples in terms of government looking across the suite of policies and measures to address whatever needs are there in terms of land reacquisition. And I don't want to speak for any tribal project, but the types of things that government has to think through are exactly what tribal government is doing with these. And I've had calls from multiple First Nations in Canada, particularly when Ontario had the program, asking how did this come to be? And I think it's great to say, look, there's tribal leadership you can talk to in the U.S., and that experience with other countries and other Indigenous communities has been really amazing to see develop and to see interactions between. Well, we're not in the room, where those training opportunities between tribes and Indigenous leaders or between other governments where that's happening, and it's been fun to be involved in. But I think that's partly answering the question.
And I guess one thing that I would add is that in my prior life, the Alberta system has some mechanisms around it that allow for agricultural projects to have aggregation associated with offset development. So there's always practical limitations to the size of a project. So when we talk about grasslands projects, which Climeco actually has an initiative with Climate Smart Group where we're doing grasslands projects and actually looking on a global basis for this types of projects. A really, really exciting initiative that we're focused on. But there's always a practical limitation to project development. So when you look at small areas of land, there's just a limitation simply because you have to do the exact same level of work depending on how the system is set up as, let's say, a larger amount of land to a certain extent. So there is an economies of scale aspect, and so Alberta's system having this aggregation element in the agricultural program allowed actually us to work with Indigenous groups to develop projects specifically in Alberta that were supportive of them and that they had the revenue associated with that project. So I think it's really fundamentally important to look at the program design elements and how those can be structured in a way that unlock that value because there can absolutely be practical limitations to the actual project development side depending on the size of space you're looking at.
Great, and I don't think we have time for any more questions except for this one, which I'll limit it to each of you get a 2-word answer. All right, so 2 words. And then we'll get off the stage and make way for the next panel. What do you see, or how would you describe the next 12 to 18 months in the world of offsets?
Love life.
Cow poop.
Continued implementation.
Well, let's give the panel a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.